Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, we proudly bring to you Mormonism Live!
Shut up and sit down.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Mormonism Live. Good evening, my companion in arms, Bill Reel.
RFM, how are you?
I'm doing great. Can't you tell?
Yeah, life is good. What's going on?
Well, I just got done last Saturday presenting by Zoom at Thrive in Florida. That's one thing.
Yeah.
How about you?
I see you're growing a little mustache, it looks like.
A very little mustache, and I don't know if I'm going to keep it very long because it's starting to really bother me.
I've tried to grow facial hair a few times, and I end up with a line all the way down where no hair grows.
Really?
So, yeah, it's kind of a weird thing, you know? So I just end up being, relatively clean shaven all the time. It's my only option.
I probably will too, because my hair kind of attacks my face.
Yeah, well, you look good. I'm glad to see you. I'm just, what a great chance to get back together and do another episode of Mormonism Live.
Well, tonight's episode is titled Critical Scholarship and Book of Abraham Historicity. Just when you thought it was safe to go back into the Book of Abraham waters, we're going to have two special guests on the show to talk about recent and perhaps even new things that they've discovered about the Book of Abraham in their researches. I'm talking specifically about Dan Vogel and Brent Metcalfe. But before we get there and bring them on, Bill, did you have something that you wanted to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment just to tell folks. I said this morning in a podcast. Well, this afternoon I did a podcast talking about the missionary numbers and the member numbers from the statistical report. But our donations are doing pretty well as an entity. They're on pace for about what they were last year. But just FYI, Mormonism Live's donations are significantly down. And
what?
Yeah, they are. So to the point where we brought in Mormonism Live in new donations, new recurring subscribers or donators, and new donations. Mormonism Live's brought in like $1,500 through its donation button going to Donor Box. And so just FYI, other podcasts are doing pretty well. Like Almost Awakened has got like $1,400 so far, and it only raised like $300 last year. I know like Ramming Up to Ruminations and some of the other ones are doing quite well. But just FYI to our listeners who seem to really love the show, Mormonism Live's donations are down significantly. And if you would go, for those who do donate, by the way, thank you very much. I'm not asking anything more from you. You do great. I don't really want much from folks. If folks love the show and they want to see us do this for years and years, just hit the donate button at mormonismlive.org. Click that donate button, and then just drop us $5 a month, something reasonable. If you want to pay us $60 a year or something like that, it really does go a long way to helping Radio Free Mormon be able to use his time wisely in terms of producing content and doing research for the podcast. And it also helps the entity and myself as well. So if we could just encourage folks who do benefit, because no offense to everyone else, Mormonism Live is the show that gets the most views and seems to get the most publicity and get the most kind of attraction to folks. And I just want to note that those are down and give you guys a chance to support the show, and we'd really appreciate it.
Lift where you stand.
Yeah, there you go. So anyway, but regardless, we're having a blast and things are going well, and we're having a great time putting these together.
Yes, and we've been working really hard on tonight's episode. And by we, I mean Dan Vogel and Brent Metcalfe, although I've certainly been talking with them a great deal on the phone. Dan has a number of slides that he's put together. Brent has put together some slides on discoveries that he's made, which we hope to get to tonight. But in order to do that, we probably better bring him on and get started. What do you think, Bill? You might be muted, Bill.
Yeah. Sorry. We've added him to the stream. I'm going to put some names up so we don't have to flip screens all the time. And that's going to be right.
Hello, everybody.
Anytime there's no comments, Maven, from time to time, if you'll just have no comments on the screen for a few seconds here or there, just so people can see those names. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, there's Dan Vogel and Brent Metcalfe, two of the leading people in Book of Abraham studies. I think I can say that without any fear of contradiction.
I think you probably can as well. So
then it must be true, because you're a very humble bumble, and if you say that's true, it's got to be true.
yeah, well, let's put it this way. It's something that Dan and I have been in the historical trenches on for decades. This isn't like a new fad that we got into. This is something we've been doing for a very, very long time. And, I had already gone through and done transcripts of the different manuscripts, related to the Book of Abraham and Joseph Smith's Egyptian project before the Joseph Smith papers ever came out with theirs. Right? I had already gone through and done all of that, even after Mike Marquardt did his, which that was a great start considering the type of source that he had to deal with, right? Which was a microfilm of them. And then I had photographs, and I went through and did transcripts of all the documents, right down to all the erasures, the changes that were made, and everything else. And so this is something, that we've both been involved in for decades. And as I said, I had done this decades ago, and here we are, so yeah.
And here we are.
We know our shit, right? That's what I'm trying to say.
Would you agree with that, Dan?
Can I say that on here?
I think you
can
did.
Say anything.
Okay. All right.
Yes. You can say it again if you wanted to
later.
Yeah, I mean, no, we've read these documents so many times, it's not even funny. I mean, I think that's probably one of the biggest complaints that Dan and I have about folks who take an apologetic approach, is that sometimes we're so bewildered. It's like, have you even read these documents? And, again, here we are. I've read them more times than I can count.
Well, the Egyptologists don't focus on the English documents all that well. And that's where we come in, because we're early Mormon document specialists. And
right.
Exactly.
And I was talking with someone earlier who had mentioned about, after 13 hours with Robert Ridner, what more is there to say? And I think that's an important distinction, is that Robert Ridner had a lot to say about Egyptology, but he didn't really have anything to say about the early documents, like the Abraham Egyptian or translation documents that were made as part of creating the Book of Abraham.
Well, one of the things that I actually focused on was going through and correcting handwriting identifications in the manuscripts. I haven't seen any of the Egyptologists doing that, right? And so that's one of the things that I've tried to do, and I've discovered some incredibly unique things with these documents. Just as a quick example, Joseph Smith's Egyptian alphabet document. It was thought that there was the word Kola was in Warren Parrish's handwriting. It's not. It's in Joseph Smith's handwriting. At the end of the document, there are some words dealing with Abraham and so on. And actually, we have right there Joseph Smith's handwriting, William W. Phelps, and Oliver Cowdery. All three of them are on this document. That has never been talked about before. And so that's the type of level that we have to take this to. We can't be satisfied anymore with just treating these documents in such simplistic ways. We need to be analyzing every detail of these documents, understanding every erasure that occurs and what the meaning is when a name is changed or something like that. And that's not something that I've really seen. And now I think that both Dan and I have that interest. And I think that Robin and Brian, with their Joseph Smith Papers project, had the same interest. And so I was very pleased and proud of what they had done. And I hope to see more analysis like that in the future.
All right, so let me just jump in here in order to segue into the main thrust of tonight's presentation, which involves slides, which goes to one of my favorite apologists, my favorite Egyptologist apologist, Dr. John Ghee, because he said something recently that's going to be in the first slide and that caught Dan's attention enough that he wanted to elaborate upon it, and Brent will as well tonight. But exactly what he was saying was, all the critics are all focusing on these translation documents like you were talking about. And apparently John Ghee, feels sufficiently uncomfortable with the translation documents that he doesn't want people to look at those. Instead, he wants them to look at the text of the Book of Abraham itself. And then he sort of chides critics for what he says is they never look at the text, implying that the text itself would carry the day for the Book of Abraham's historicity and authenticity, regardless of what the translation documents look like. We've got Maven here showing up on the screen.
Sorry, I'm interrupting, but I did want to say thank you to everybody who's been donating. We've had several donations since asking. Doug for 100, Adam donated 20. I don't know if it's Swanee or Sweeney Speed Ramsey 20. And then we have an anonymous donation for 100, another one for 20. Paul, $5. Thank you so much. And then we have one for $1,000. So thank you, whoever that was. We really appreciate that.
Hey, I want to say thank you for everybody, for the $1,000, for the $5, for everything in between. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Maven, thanks for bringing that up. And Maven, do you have the first slide with John Ghee?
Oh, yes, I do.
It's got a picture of John Ghee on it. To me, it looks like he sort of had the ring of power a little too long.
Yeah, I think that brick wall's kind of symbolic.
Yeah. But there he is. This is from last December or so when he's doing an interview with Scott Gordon from FAIR. And it's either the ring too long or he's doing his Uncle Joe impression from Petticoat Junction. I can't remember which, or I can't tell which. But here's the first quote there. Hey, Bill, are you there? Do you have your mouth full?
I do, but I can still read.
Go ahead and read. Read with your mouth full. The audience loves that.
I just told the viewers not to judge me. I'm trying to finish up dessert.
They like seafood.
I made dinner tonight and I was running late. So here we go. Maybe I'll sound like John Ghee with food in my mouth.
You might.
The critics don't really get into the content of the Book of Abraham. They don't read it carefully. In some cases, don't read it at all. And a lot of them just dismiss it as not being historically authentic. So they don't need to read it. They don't need to test it. And so if you eliminate the text from consideration, then the only sort of discussion point that you get is the translation issue. So that's why the critics are all concerned with the translation, but not the result of the translation.
Let me throw this to Dan and say, do you think that's correct? Because I think you're a critic. I think you were what John Ghee would call a critic. I think Brent is too. Do you never deal with the text?
Well, this is irony, because we do deal with the text, and actually they only deal with little parts of it that support their views on trying to prove or use it as a tool to prove that it's ancient. Don't look at the alphabet and grammar and the characters with the fake translation next to them. Don't look at those. Right. Look at these parallels that we draw between the text and the ancient world, and they'll quote anything in the ancient world for a span of thousands of years over any country, anything.
Thousands of miles.
To get their parallels,
Yes.
We all heard of the phrase parallel mania. Well, this is where you make parallels that just are not appropriate, have no context. We might run into some later in our discussion.
All right, Dan, I'm throwing it to you because these are mainly the slides that you have arranged and ordered. So
yes,
you take
jump
the ball.
Jump in anytime you want.
Okay.
Okay, so Maven, the next slide, please.
And before anybody goes on, just FYI, the comment up on the screen right now is not true. YouTube does not take anything because we're a nonprofit and we are registered with YouTube. The chat over to the right, once in a great while, is a super chat, and there'll be a bunch of colored stickers and all that kind of stuff. Those are not tax deductible, by the way. YouTube keeps 30% of those. We get 70. But more money does come in that way because people seem to be having more fun. The way it's set up right now, over to the right of the screen, actually I'm pointing the wrong way. It has to be the opposite. The way it is set up right now, that we are tax exempt. We are registered with YouTube. They cover all of the processing costs and they send 100% of the money to us. So you can donate right there to the right, and we do get all of that.
All right. Thanks for clarifying that, Bill, because I know a lot of listeners want to make sure that their dollars are going where they want them to go. Dan, back to you, my friend.
So this is the timeline for 1835. This does not include what Joe Smith did in Nauvoo, but we want you to have at least an idea of how it progressed, because an important argument comes out of this, a little item of time. Well, so Joe Smith gets the papyri in or purchases them in early July 1835, and then by late July 1835, he's produced 3 alphabets, and then he started a grammar book. So you can see the grammar book at the top, and another book which doesn't exist anymore. I call it a translation book. This is where the translation started. The first 3 verses were entered into this book about the same time, or just before the grammar book was created and begun in late July, and the last entries were in October of 1835. Then we get to the next part, which is November 1835. And that's where Abraham, chapter 1, verse 4 to 2, verse 6, is simultaneously dictated to Frederick G. Williams and Warren Parrish. Then after that, Warren Parrish copies those into that translation book, and then takes dictation from Joseph Smith all the way up to chapter 2, verse 18. And that's what we're going to focus on in our discussion today. So the important element here is that there's 2 months where Joseph Smith, after dictating 3 verses, he has 2 months to think about what he's going to dictate the following November, whenever he's ready, but it happened to be November. And he also has a time where he creates these Egyptian alphabets and a grammar, and he can brainstorm and think of ideas. So any comments, gentlemen?
No, not right now. How about you, Brent?
Well, I was just going to say that those first 3 verses are extremely interesting because there's a portion of them that seems to have dependency on the grammar and alphabet. And the reason why I say that is because they are duplicated twice in that volume. And in the first instance, the demarcator it's a series of commas that separate the different clauses. Whereas in the second instance, which is a later instance, right? Because the book is actually being written from back to front. And so in the second instance, it separated, the demarcators are all semicolons. That's what appears in the actual final, first 3 verses of the translation document. And that suggests that at least that portion, it has some type of dependent relationship with the Egyptian alphabet and grammar. And so, or I should say the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language. Some people have been chastised for using the old term that people used to call it all the time. But, so I think that's demonstrable. And and when Dan says that there was a translation volume, this is very important to note, because the pages were actually excised out of it, and you can see it by the way that the pages are cut, right? The pages are literally cut out of a volume. And so that's how we know that it was in some type of volume originally and then removed. And so that's just kind of an interesting facet. But again, the stuff that I'm getting into, a lot of people may be going, well, who cares about any of that, right? But that's the type of stuff that Dan and I have to look at and say, how does this all work? What exactly are we looking at here? And so those details aren't, obscure minutia to us. They actually carry meaning to the overall interpretation of these volumes.
Thanks for that clarification on the pages that were cut.
Yeah,
because they were cut with a straight edge, obviously.
exactly.
It's all crooked, and it cuts through some of the characters and some of the English translation.
Precisely.
So kind of sloppy, but
Yeah.
so we have the pages, but we don't have the book anymore.
Right.
Exactly.
Anyway, so the important point takeaway from this slide is that there's a 2-month gap for Joseph Smith to think about what he's going to dictate as far as the Book of Abraham. He could look things up in books and things and talk about it with other people, and certainly dictating these Egyptian alphabets and grammar book. They call it a Gale sometimes, Grammar and Alphabet of the Egyptian Language, was a good place to think about these things. So next slide. Yeah. The next slide is kind of an overview of what we think is the 19th century sources for the Book of Abraham. And so the first 3 verses right away talk about a rightful heir by birth, that Abraham's a rightful heir by birth to the high priesthood. And this reflects on D&C 107, which was just added to and modified for the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants 2 months earlier. And so it gets reflected in the Book of Abraham. So he's more or less citing his own previous work,
Right. And then this was kind of a revelation, pardon the pun, to me, when I realized that Doctrine and Covenants section 107, and you have the verses there, 40 through 57, where it delineates the different, does it go all the way back to Adam and talk about the high priests and how the priesthood...
So 2 months before he gets the Book of Abraham, he's dictating or adding to a previous revelation that dated to November of 1831 that talked about Bishop Partridge and the president of the high priesthood, which I'll talk about in a moment. So 2 months prior to getting the Book of Abraham, he's concerned with establishing a ordination lineage from Adam to Noah, and Enoch, I guess you would say. It talks about the valley of Adam-on-Diamond and Adam coming and blessing his family, but where all the high priests came. Though the problem is the Old Testament doesn't have any priesthood lineage among the patriarchs, and so it would be something that would not be in the Bible. And he's trying to establish the high priesthood through his own revelations, and then finally in a text that he translates in the Book of Abraham. So this is a 19th century, D&C 107 is a 19th century source for the Book of Abraham. And this is something that you won't get from Ghee and Milstein. Okay? They don't know about this stuff, as far as I know.
It was very interesting to me that this is something that is obviously concerning Joseph Smith. Whether you think he's the author or not of Doctrine and Covenants, section 107, it's something that's on his mind about this patriarchal priesthood. And by patriarchal, I mean a priesthood handed down by the patriarchs, father to son, etc., in May of 1835. And then the very first 3 verses over there at the top left of the Book of Abraham, which is the very first thing that was translated, was Abraham is a rightful heir by birth to the high priesthood. And he says, I got it from the fathers.
Right.
Exactly. So you will see in our discussion the motivations for all this.
Okay.
So then when he resumes dictating the translation in November, it starts with verse 4, and 4 through 20 is about the attempted sacrifice of Abraham. And this is basically inspired from facsimile 1, which we're going to discuss that also. Then he gets into the founding of Egypt, that they're Hamites, and they start a patriarchal government, but it's unauthorized. And this comes from part 1 of the Egyptian alphabet and the Gale, except those is 2 sources that were dictated first. It's not speaking about Abraham. It's talking about Ketumen, Princess Ketumen, and her parents, and the founding of, and they live 800 years after Abraham. And they are basically the mummies that came with the papyri. And that's what the Egyptian alphabet and grammar are about. They're mostly about Ketumen and some other documents that have nothing to do with the Book of Abraham. So
it's almost like it's a provenance for the Book of Abraham, isn't it?
Yeah.
And two, I should add that in the Egyptian alphabet, Ketumen almost becomes a title.
Yeah.
And as does Oneida or Oneidas, as the case may be.
And that's
Oneidas originally.
And that's Ketumen's dad, right?
Correct. And they become carryovers into the actual Book of Abraham narrative, where now they are alive during Abraham's day. And Oneida, at first the manuscript read Oneidas, and then it gets amended to Oneida. He lives during that day. And I think that one of the 3 virgins that are killed, that's Ketumen, right? That's being killed. And because if you remember from the notebooks, she's only 25 when she dies, but it doesn't tell you how she died or anything like that. And so we'll get to the 3 virgins again a little bit later. So we've got more to talk about that. But those are some thoughts. When you go through the Egyptian alphabet documents, Ketumen appears to be some type of title that explains that this is a young unmarried woman and so on, right? And so I think that that's probably what we're looking at. And that's why we get such confusion between who is Ketumen all the way through this. And I think that Dan is right. I think the initial Ketumen is actually one of the mummies, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
Onitis is the other one.
Right.
Is the one that, Oneida is well, that's what Lucy Smith said, remember?
Precisely.
When she used to show the mummies and charge money for it, she would say, this is Onitis, the king, right here.
Exactly.
And the Book of Abraham came from the chest of that male mummy.
Exactly.
And the Book of Joseph, or the Tal Sheret Men papyrus, came from the chest of one of the female mummies.
Precisely, right.
Yeah. So
Yep.
that's basically what the first part of the alphabets and the grammar are about, this family and the mummies. And when it gets developed in the grammar, it goes into more detail and actually talks about the female having a record.
Right.
So
Exactly.
that's what it's about. It's not about Abraham.
Right.
And when you're saying that, you're talking about the translation documents, the
grammar,
what is it? The GAE grammar and alphabet.
Yeah, the Gale and the Egyptian
the three alphabets, and then the three alphabets get expanded in the book, which is the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, because grammar is added to the alphabets, and then the alphabets are expanded in 5 degrees. And as they expand, you can see his ideas are developing towards dictating the Book of Abraham. So
not to throw you off, but let me just make the passing observation that the confusion between Ta Sheret Men, is that the actual name? What's the name that Joseph Smith came up?
The Book of Joseph, or the record of Joseph.
But Joseph's princess.
Joseph, the patriarch Joseph.
I'm sorry. No, Joseph Smith's princess. What was her name again?
Ketumen?
Ketumen. Okay. Ta Sheret Men is actually the Egyptian name, but Ketumen is the name that Joseph Smith came up with.
No, the Ketumen comes from an epitaph from the papyrus of Amenhotep, which we don't have, but they copied into those 2 little notebooks called the Valuable Discovery notebooks and the Egyptian character notebooks. And they copied it into there, and Joseph Smith translated a portion that has the epitaph of Ketumen. That was one of the first things they did, was to preserve the documents that were crumbling. And it was the Amenhotep, who was a priest, and it was his Book of the Dead that they had a portion of. And that is where the passage comes from. So the first part of the alphabets that gets expanded in the grammar book has to do with Amenhotep. Nothing about you, not even the Hor papyrus, where Abraham supposedly was translated from. But then there's like 3 books of the dead, 2 books of the dead, 1 book of breathings.
Right. And Dan, I'm afraid I've gotten you off in the weeds there. But I was just asking, is Ketumen is the name of the princess that Joseph Smith came up with to be the daughter of Oneida, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
and there's a confusion with Ketumen because in these the grammar and alphabet, Ketumen ends up existing like 800 years before Abraham, or 800 years after Abraham. And then in the text, there's an argument that she shows up, and at least Oneida does, during the life of Abraham, correct?
Right.
It's Brent's theory.
So basically, it's an evolution where in the Valuable Discovery documents, she and her father live, hundreds of years after Abraham. But then in the Egyptian alphabet documents, all of a sudden those names become titles, right? They become meanings of
like
words.
Pharaoh, like the name Pharaoh.
Right? Exactly. They become words that have meaning. So by the time you get to the Abraham translation, now all of a sudden they're alive and well. Well, of course they are, because these are the titles of the king and the princess. Right? And so that's kind of what I think is going on there. and why Oneidas, changed to Oneida, ends up in the actual Book of Abraham proper.
Okay, now having established that, let me just make what is now the unremarkable observation, which I took a whole long way to get around to, which is that the confusion between the princess Ketumans, right? Or possible confusion between the princess Ketuman seems to be perhaps mirrored in the Book of Abraham with the confusion between the woman named Egyptus.
Sure. Oh, the whole thing with Egyptus is a whole nother conversation.
Right. Is she the wife of Ham or is she his daughter?
No. She originally it's Zepta. The wife of Ham is named Zepta. Then it becomes Jephthah with a J, then Jephthah with a G, then Jephthus, and then eventually Egyptus. That's the evolution through the manuscripts. In other words, it doesn't start out really cleanly and follow through. So what we end up with in the Book of Abraham, in the final version, is her name is Egyptus. And her daughter's name is also Egyptus. Right?
Yeah, that's one way of reading it.
Right. And even the daughter's name goes through multiple spellings of what the name actually sounds like. And so I think that that's really a kind of an interesting thing to understand, that this was not just a really super fluid process where everything was smooth all the way through. It was kind of chunky, where they're kind of figuring out some things as they go. And those names, like the wife of Ham, is a good example where they're trying to figure it out as they go along. And so that's an interesting detail. But anyway, I digress.
Yes.
And we should probably go on to the next slide.
Okay. So, no, not on the next slide. No.
Oh, okay.
Just
Sorry.
further down.
So basically, we're going to do a show on this slide because we could.
No.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, the founding of Egypt, you might recall that the Book of Abraham talks about Egyptus, or the daughter of Ham, discovering Egypt while Egypt was still underwater and founding her sons in it. And then the Pharaoh, her son, establishes an illegitimate patriarchal government because he doesn't have the correct authority because he's not the firstborn. Anyway, so that is talking about Ketuman and their history going back to the beginning of Egypt. Well, that gets dropped in to the Book of Abraham. Well, just misdictating the Book of Abraham, that whole idea gets dropped in. But that is a 19th century source for the Book of Abraham. So that's why I list it. The next phase is...
Can I just make one quick comment? Because I think that this is really important and has been so controversial over the years. And that is, were the descendants of Ham actually denied the priesthood per se? And I've made the argument that no, they weren't. What they were denied was the patriarchal priesthood, right?
Yes.
So they could hold other, whatever,
Brigham Young got it right.
Whatever, right? They could hold other priesthoods, but it's the patriarchal priesthood that they're being denied. And for one thing, the reason why is because their authority is coming through a matrilineal line. It's coming through their mother and not through their father, right? Because it's their mother back to Ham. And so I think that that's that's how I see that Joseph Smith was comfortable in having, descendants of, slaves who were
Abel.
brought over. Yeah, exactly. Holding the priesthood.
Yeah.
Because they weren't being restricted from that priesthood. It was from the patriarchal priesthood that they couldn't hold. And so that's a very different interpretation. And it's not until after Joseph Smith's death, the earliest reference I found, I believe, is from 1845, from the Council of 50 Minutes, where one of the apostles refers to the book of Abraham as restricting African Americans from holding the priesthood. And that's, as far as I know, that is the first time that anyone is using that as a blanket argument for why they can't hold the priesthood. Because Joseph Smith had been giving it to African Americans all along. So anyway.
Well, the motivation, briefly, the motivation behind this is that it's coming in 1835, and he's predicted that Zion will be restored on the 11th of September, 1836. And this is to say that the blacks will not have any leadership positions in that patriarchal government that Zion will be administered by. And that was to placate the people in Jackson County.
Yeah.
That's my interpretation anyway.
And it's a fascinating one because it puts it in its historical context. And we know that Joseph Smith, the Saints had been kicked out of Jackson County in 1833. And it was a very, very difficult situation.
Yeah.
And a lot of it was the concerns of the Missourians about the abolitionist tendencies of Northerners coming down there. And so this is sort of like a sop to try and make them feel better and more kindly toward the Latter-day Saints, so they could maybe get back there to Jackson County, because this is 1835. 1834 was when they tried to take it by force, right?
Yeah.
With Zion's camp.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Which didn't work. We'll be getting to that.
Okay.
Okay. So the next thing is that chapter 2 is essentially an inspired revision of Genesis chapters 11 and 12. We know Joseph Smith, he spent 3 years doing an inspired revision of the whole Bible. And so he's quite adept at revising biblical, texts according to his desires. And so basically what we're going to get and it's going to be very interesting, but in chapter 2, part of chapter 2, we'll be getting Abraham flees from Ur in Babylon to Haran, and then to Egypt to escape the famine. Then we have chapter 3 is Abraham's vision of the cosmos and premortal intelligences, which basically comes from the alphabet and grammar, where he has a detailed description of the cosmos of 15 fixed planets. And we'll talk about that later too. He also has dictated Moses chapter 4, that talks about the preexistence and the, Satan and his followers being cast down. Then it also reflects his Hebrew lessons, has Hebrew words in there that he only learned in 1836. So this is the part that is in Nauvoo, of course. Then it also reflects natural theology. People particularly talk about Thomas Dick's philosophy, and natural theologians in the 19th century were theologians that tried to harmonize theology with known science at the time, which is outdated now, which makes Joseph Smith's reflections of of natural theology of that time look a little, out of date. Which is the idea that there's large planets that revolve, not just our solar system, but the whole solar system and the whole Milky Way revolves around other Milky Way type things. And all of those revolve around God's throne, the center of light. Well, that makes, and this is the peculiar thing about the Joseph Smith's cosmology here, is that he talks about the sun as both a fixed planet and a moving planet. And planet, he calls it a planet, first of all, which coincides with people in 19th century believing the sun was inhabited. They didn't know anything about nuclear fission and all that kind of stuff. And so the sun's inhabited, all the planets are inhabited in the 19th century theology of the natural theologians. And everything revolves around each other so that the sun does move. When it's stationary in our system, but in a larger system, it's moving. So, and that reflects the 19th century thing. But we'll talk a little bit about that in conjunction with facsimile too. And the last part, chapters 4 and 5, of course, are basically an inspired revision of Genesis chapter 1 and 2, the creation story, with some of his Hebrew lessons thrown in for good measure. So, but we are not going to talk about that because everybody basically understands that that's a 19th century version of the Genesis, a revision of Genesis. So, okay, next slide.
Finally.
So I look at the Book of Abraham as a sort of pseudepigrapha, which this is Bart Ehrman. These are his two major books on pseudepigrapha. The one on the right is the New Testament pseudepigrapha. I think there's actually books in the New Testament that are not written by the people that have the names attached to them, that they're believed to have been written by others for various reasons. The one on the left is, like the Apocalypse of Abraham. There's a pseudepigraphic writing already of Abraham, and Maccabees and some other, Book of Enoch. These are all books that were written not by Enoch, by someone else that wanted to import doctrines into the Christian community and used Enoch's authority to do it. And that's what I think Joseph Smith's doing. So the quote here was, so pseudepigrapha is biblical literature, a work affecting biblical style and usually spurious attribution to a biblical character. So, and the motivation, Bart Ehrman tells us, was to give their own religious views. These authors, the pseudonymous authors, their own religious views, often deemed heretical by the dominant group of believers, respectability and authority that otherwise would not be given an obscure author. So this is where I say that in writing the Book of Mormon, even Joseph Smith adopted a pseudepigraphical style because no one would have bought a theological book written by a money-digging farmer. So he got authority, and he was able to get his ideas into the Christian community that way. Any comments?
Not for me. Brent?
No, I'm good. I would have a few comments, but I think it would be good to progress along. Otherwise, we're going to be here for 5 hours. So.
Thank you, Brent.
Yeah,
Okay.
it looks like Dr. Ghee has joined us as well. Dr. Ghee, did you have anything you wanted to say about this?
Yeah, I've kept him muted. I keep kicking him out, but he just keeps showing up. So
like
he doesn't have anything to add. He's just watching and just checking this out.
Okay.
Oh, that's cool.
Continue,
Okay.
Mr. Vogel.
Okay, so the first 3 verses dictated in July of 1835, the first month that he has these papyri, the very first three verses talk about this high priesthood we mentioned. This is in the highlighted part is the most important. I became a rightful heir, a high priest, holding the right belonging to the fathers. It was conferred upon me from the fathers. It came down from the fathers from the beginning of time, yea, even the beginning or before the foundation of the earth, down to the present time, even the right of the firstborn or the first man, who is Adam, or first father, through the fathers unto me. Okay, so the first three verses prove the book of Abraham is not an ancient book. Okay, and the claim that there was a chain of ordinations to the high priesthood from Adam to Abraham is fiction and is based on a misinterpretation of Hebrews chapter 7 that talks about Jesus being the great high priest after the order of Melchizedek. And it's a very involved thing, but so we're not going to discuss it here, but this is one of the things that's anachronistic, that it's like a red flag pointing to the Book of Abraham being a modern production and to support Joseph Smith's previous innovations, and that's what we're going to discuss next. So,
and Dan, by anachronistic,
yes.
you mean mentioning Abraham as being a high priest, as opposed to Aaron, Moses' brother, being the first high priest?
Well, exactly. Aaron being the high priest over the other priests, and we're going to see that a lot of Mormons in Joseph Smith's day, a lot of his followers, didn't exactly find that credible, that because they had the traditional view of Hebrews 7, and they some of them were very ranking Mormons, like David Whitmer. And John Whitmer. The whole presidency basically in Missouri didn't quite buy this high priesthood, and when Joseph Smith introduced it, he had trouble. So the next slide will show and so we're going to kind of briefly go through the development of priesthood, something that John Ghee and Kerry Muhlestein probably can't do. But so,
by the way, Dan,
yeah.
Do you think that the trouble that Joseph Smith had introducing the idea of a high priesthood played into why it was that he thought it was important to instantiate that doctrine in a new book of scripture, in the book of Abraham? Yes,
that's exactly it. He wanted ancient authority. A lot of Joseph Smith's followers questioned some of his revelations. I mean, one person said, when they were being criticized of being a follower of Joseph Smith, they said, well, we only follow him insofar as his revelations coincide with the scriptures, meaning the Bible and the Book of Mormon. And so they weren't like current Mormons who weren't allowed to question anything. They didn't have that rule down really well back then. So
these next two slides that you have about the trajectory of Joseph Smith's priesthood innovations, I think is absolutely fascinating, because it talks about the different things he did with the priesthood and places it chronologically and contextually in such a way as to make absolute sense to me in a way it never had before.
Well, thank you. And I hope it works on everybody else too. But let's see what it says. So June 1831, Joseph Smith introduces the high priesthood at a church conference in Kirtland, and some of the elders questioned the propriety of this new priesthood. And John Correll, who was the church historian, wrote a history of the church in 1839. He mentioned that it took a while to convince some of these brethren that the high priesthood was a legitimate thing to have, and to ordain people to the high priesthood. Then in July and August 1831, Joseph Smith visited Missouri, during which he had a jurisdictional dispute with Bishop Edward Partridge. Now, that probably doesn't happen nowadays anymore, but Joseph Smith was confronted by Bishop Partridge and said, I'm the bishop here. Why are you trying to order people around and, tell us what land to buy or not to buy? And so he was highly criticized, and it's a long story. And if you want to read about it, my biography will be coming out next year that talks all about this stuff. So on the 11th, he went back to Ohio, And on the 11th of November, 1831, he dictated a revelation appointing himself as president of the high priesthood over the whole church, specifically mentioning its superiority over the office of bishop. That the bishop is not equal to it, it says. So then on the 25th of January, 1832, he was ordained as president of the high priesthood by Sidney Rigdon at a conference in Amherst, Ohio. Following which, on the 26th of April, 1832, he was sustained as president of the high priesthood in Missouri. So he has all the people in Missouri, all the people questioning him, sustain him as president of the high priesthood. The Missouri leaders later, they said, okay, they shook hands and they went back to Ohio. But soon after, all these letters start coming from Missouri calling him, dictatorial, and the actual wording of one of them was accusing Brother Joseph in a rather indirect way of seeking after monarchical power and authority. And so they were resisting this. Hey, now all of a sudden he's president of the high priesthood. He's like rose above all of us. And they didn't like that. They wanted the eldership to be more egalitarian. Then in September 1832, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation, which is now D&C 84, which claimed that the high priesthood was handed down to Moses through a chain of ordinations back to Adam, about which the Bible is silent. So the Bible says nothing about any of this stuff, but he has a revelation. Here's his lineage of priesthood, a chain of ordinations. So he's establishing this priesthood, high priesthood, in ancient times, but it's through his own revelations. In May to July 1834, Joseph Smith led a quasi-military expedition of more than 200 Mormons to Missouri in an unsuccessful effort to return the saints to their lands in Jackson County. When he got back to Ohio, he experienced a fallout from the failure of his leadership, and his leadership was questioned in both Ohio and Missouri. So he's in trouble. His charisma is being challenged. His charismatic authority and leadership is being challenged. So Maven, can you give us the next slide, please? Thank you. In September of 1834, in a letter to W.W. Phelps in Missouri, Oliver Cowdery, with Smith's help, wrote the first account of his and Smith's ordination by an unnamed angel in May 1829, which was published in the Messenger and Advocate the following month. This dramatically changed the concept of authority and made it more difficult to break away from the chain of ordinations back to an undisputed source of authority. So basically, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery got together and decided they would tell this story, and Cowdery would be a witness, a second witness. It wouldn't be just Joseph Smith, that they were ordained by an angel. So it's easy to break away if the authority is charismatic. Anybody can be charismatic and get revelations and break away. Well, once you establish this chain of authority, it makes it harder to break away. You now have to justify your new authority.
Dan, looking at this retrospectively, from where we are now and when I joined the church and took the missionary discussions, it's pretty easy to identify that this would have been John the Baptist coming in May of 1829 to give the Aaronic priesthood. But is this the first mention of an angel coming to give authority to Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery? It's as late as September of 1834, more than 5 years after the alleged date had happened.
Yep. And this is exactly why David Whitmer, the president of the Missouri church, he should know, said he didn't hear anything about it until 1834 or 5. And William E. McClellan said the same thing, and John Whitmer said the same thing. This was a total surprise to them.
And at this point,
they've been operating, baptizing, ordaining, and doing all the church functions, not knowing where the priesthood came from. I mean, that's remarkable.
It is. And at this point, it's just an unnamed angel. It has yet to be
Yes.
identified as John the Baptist, and there's no mention of Peter, James, and John in a separate ordination
Right.
yet.
Not yet. So Oliver Cowdery publishes this, or he publishes it, but he also writes it to, instead of Joseph Smith writing it, right? Cowdery writes it with Joseph Smith's help, he says, and sends it off to Missouri. So on the 5th of December, 1834, just a few months later, Oliver Cowdery is ordained as assistant president or co-president of the church by Sidney Rigdon. This shot him up above Sidney Rigdon and Frederick G. Williams, who were Joseph Smith's counselors in the presidency of the high priesthood. This shot Cowdery up over everybody, right next to Joseph Smith.
Because there is a first presidency at this time.
Well, a term comes later, actually, but it's the presidency of the high priesthood. Still.
Okay. And that exists at this time, the presidency.
And that turns into the first presidency, yeah.
And Oliver Cowdery, within that context, is made a co-president with Joseph Smith. Mm-hmm. And Joseph Smith still has his two counselors, one of whom is Sidney Rigdon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Got it.
And Frederick G. Williams.
Do you think that's a payoff at all to Oliver Cowdery?
Yes, I do.
How do you mean?
Well, so now that they both were ordained by the angel, because that didn't happen before, right. Now they're now both ordained. Now, first and second elder becomes kind of a different meaning. It kind of makes Cowdery equal. So then on the 6th, Joseph Smith Sr. is ordained as the first patriarch of the church.
By the way, for those listening in audio, that's 6th of December, 1834. Sorry, Dan, go ahead.
Oh, thank you.
That's okay.
The following February, 1835, the Quorum of 12 Apostles and the Quorum of 70 are organized. And this was like a reward for those who went to Zion and failed in their mission. This is kind of a reward. Now, because Charisma has reached a crisis point with the failure in Jackson County, Missouri, Joseph Smith organizes a hierarchy with more earnestness, and it then becomes, when prophecy fails, you start focusing on kingdom building, and that's what he's doing. That's part of one of his reactions, to pull them in, to reward them, to make them more attached to the organization, so that it's less likely for them to leave or to apostatize or to break off and start their own church. Then from March to May 1835, we mentioned this already, Joseph Smith received revised revelations for publication, adding references about priesthood to previous revelations. He more or less added to previous revelations things that came later. So these things that he adds are anachronistic because they could not have happened in the time frame in which he has placed them. So in 1830 Revelation, which is D&C 27, he added references to his and Cowdery's ordination by John the Baptist. And this is where he names them, John the Baptist. And Peter, James, and John. He mentions Peter, James, and John, who delivered the keys of the apostleship. Okay, not the Melchizedek priesthood. The Melchizedek priesthood is still the June introduction of the high priesthood.
And that's June of 1831, correct?
June 1831. And that's the introduction or the revelation of the high priesthood. But Peter, James, and John restored the apostleship, which Cowdery failed to mention when he organized the 12 apostles. So I conclude that the Peter, James, and John story was created after the apostles were organized as a justification for the keys that they now held. Then to an 1831 revelation, D&C 107 that we've talked about before, he added instructions on priesthood, which mentioned that it was the duty of the 12 to ordain patriarchs, and included an ordination lineage of the high priesthood and patriarchal priesthood from Adam to Noah, which he said was recorded in the book of Enoch to be testified of in due time. So this is March to May, somewhere in there. He revised these, and he mentioned that this was to be proven. This priesthood lineage is to be proven in the book of Enoch, testified in due time. But then, a few months later, the papyri fall into his lap, and he uses those to do what he wanted to do. If he was going to dictate a pseudepigraphic book of Enoch, it wouldn't be any better than, his revelations, really. But now he has an actual text that he can weld his new ideas to, which is
almost what he had laid the groundwork for doing in a future book of Enoch.
Yeah.
He ends up doing with the book of Abraham because of the papyrus.
Yeah. And this is exactly what pseudepigraphists did in ancient times. So then the next slide, please, Maven. Buffering. Okay.
This is really interesting stuff here.
Yeah, this part here is like, to me, when I learned about this, is mind blowing. Right, Brent?
Yeah.
This is where they also, about in 1834, started a patriarchal blessing book, where Joseph Smith's senior blessings were recorded in, and Joseph Smith's blessings were also recorded in this by Oliver Cowdery. And while they were recording these these patriarchal blessings into this book, they were revising these just the same way they were revising the Revelations. So they're reconceptualizing the whole priesthood, and the Book of Abraham is all tied into this whole large project of rewriting history, consolidating authority and power in Joseph Smith, really, and Oliver Cowdery. So
now Oliver Cowdery now takes this story that apparently he and Joseph Smith have come up with about being ordained by an unnamed angel, and now says that this is the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy by Joseph.
Right. So,
and keep in mind too that Oliver Cowdery is already referring to himself as an apostle of Jesus Christ in June of 1829, right? And a
charismatic apostle.
Yeah, that's his revelation on organizing the church. But the concept of authority that was coming from the Book of Mormon was basically the priesthood of the believer. And so, for example, when Alma, baptizes himself, right?
And Helaman.
Yeah. The Spirit of God comes upon him. And he baptizes himself because now he has the authority to do it. He doesn't need anybody to ordain him to anything.
Right. And this is what.
So it's a very different model back then.
Yes.
And I think that that's where Cowdery is coming from. When he says he's an apostle of Jesus Christ, he means that he's a special witness of Jesus Christ, along with Joseph Smith.
Yes, that's the early concept that is now being transformed.
Yep.
Into more, I would say, a chain of ordinations, rather than being a Spirit-filled and having the authority through the Spirit, being possessed and having the Spirit.
The apostolic charge changed at some point, didn't it?
Yes, exactly.
And I was just going to say to Brent that that's, of course, one of the chestnuts in the Book of Mormon, which is, where did Alma get his priesthood authority? And then a lot of speculation occurs generally in the commentaries in order to make Alma receive his priesthood by someone else who had the priesthood. That, in other words, he was ordained at some point, even though it's not written in the Book of Mormon, even though the Book of Mormon doesn't seem to think that's important. But the reason why is, of course, because What we're doing now, or what those people who write those commentaries are doing, is they are taking a later concept of ordination to the priesthood that came about years after the Book of Mormon came forth, or was dictated in 1829, and trying to read that back into the Book of Mormon, when the Book of Mormon actually is not talking about any priesthood in that way, but simply a priesthood through believing and through being commissioned by the Holy Ghost. You can baptize.
It's presentism,
Well,
in the classical sense, right? They're imposing their ideas from a modern time back onto something earlier. And the fact is during that time, ministers and so on, and other lay folk who worked in the ministry, they got their authority from the Holy Ghost. It wasn't through the laying on of hands. You know, sometimes they would be commissioned by a pastor or a preacher or someone else, but that wasn't always the case. And so that's what we're seeing in the case of Alma, is that he is literally receiving the priesthood and authority. I use priesthood lightly, the authority from God to perform this act, because he has essentially what I would call the priesthood of the believers.
Right.
And that's all it took.
all right. So Oliver Cowdery writes in the Blessing book, and this is where we're going to get the idea that how they are going to use the papyri to establish their recent developments in priesthood. So Cowdery writes, therefore, we repaired to the woods, even as our father Joseph said we should, that is, to the bush, and called upon the name of the Lord. And then they get ordained by that angel. The next quote below that is a rewrite of a blessing Oliver Cowdery received from Joseph Smith in 1833. And so he's rewriting it, and he adds this in 1835. These blessings shall come upon him, Oliver, according to the blessings of the prophecy of Joseph in ancient days, which he said should come upon the seer in the last days and the scribe who should sit with him. And that should be ordained with him by the hands of the angel in the bush. And it goes on, and it mentions it. It doesn't mention by name, but alludes to apostles that were in the days of Messiah coming. And then it ends by saying that, thus saith he, even Joseph of old. So we have that Oliver Cowdery is referring to the Tal Sheretmin Papyrus, which they associated with the Joseph of old, and they're going to use that to establish another part of their recent priesthood innovations. And Joseph Smith is dictating over here the first 3 verses of the Book of Abraham, talking about the high priesthood, which establishes the presidency of the high priesthood ultimately, which both of them now belong to. So they're now at the head of the church. And the very bottom part, the Patriarchal Blessing book, compared to Abraham verse 2, is to show that he even borrows some of the wording from the Book of Abraham, verse 2 in his Patriarchal Blessing book. So that's on his mind as he's talking about this Joseph of old. So I'm done with this if everybody else is.
I was just going to say, it's also fascinating to me that Joseph Smith has already opened up the door on this idea of prophecies by Joseph of old, extra biblical prophecies.
Yes.
In 2nd Nephi chapter 3.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Although that part doesn't mention anything about an angel or a bush.
No, he just prophesies about Joseph,
Right.
And Joseph is named after his father Joseph,
Yeah.
and so on, right? Everybody has the name Joseph. So yeah.
Yeah, pretty precise prophecy from way earliest prophecy ever, practically, that we have.
Fools mock, but
it's
they
so
shall mourn,
accurate.
Dan.
Oh, well, the
Right.
prophecy is so accurate yet the Book of Mormon can't see beyond Joseph Smith's day very clearly.
Right.
So retroactive prophecy is so clear. So here we have facsimile 1, which is really Joseph Smith adding the knife to Anubis's hand.
Can I ask a question here really quick, though? This is away from what you're talking about, but I told RFM I needed to ask this tonight. There's the carving with Anubis where it looks like they carved the nose off.
Yeah.
Do we know for sure there was a nose there and it was carved off, or is it highly likely? Like it. Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
It does.
And to me, it's another dead giveaway.
It's
Paul,
it seems Paul Osborne. Hello, Paul Osborne. He's been the one that I think. I don't know. Maybe he did discover it.
I wonder if we should have him on at some point and have that conversation, because it seems like a very obvious moment where Joseph seems to have gone like, "Uh-oh, I think I know what this figure is. It's in the other document, and I need to alter this so it doesn't look like a match."
Yeah, this is facsimile 3.
Yeah.
Right. Facsimile 3, it's what was almost doubtless Anubis, but ends up being a strange little black figure with a pinhead, and it looks like a spike in his head.
Yeah.
And what Paul Osborne suggests is that this is Anubis. The blackness is from his black fur, and that his snout was cut out of the lead printing plate that had already been prepared with the snout, because Anubis, being a jackal, has a nice snout, and that it now had to be changed in order to make it look like a slave is who it ends up being identified by Joseph. So they take the snout off, and it ends up making a very strange looking little figure there who gets identified as the slave. And I can't remember, is that what's the name of the slave? Do you remember?
Oh, geez.
Is it like, it's not Olibish, because that's
no, it's right on the tip of my tongue.
Sorry, pop quiz.
Yeah. Okay. The one thing that I would want to know more about with that is that why leave the jackal ears? And so on top of the head, and that doesn't seem right to me. So I think that the papyrus could well have been damaged as well, and not necessarily a direct manipulation of what we're looking at. And
this would be the print plate, and
correct.
What looks to me and looks to most others who have looked at this is that this is Anubis, and it's got, right? Is this Anubis? Is that what I'm saying? Am I saying that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
And this has it would have had the beak on it if it was the Anubis character.
That's his ear. That's his ear.
And it looks like the beak there. You can see the marks there where it was something was done in a specific shape that seems to indicate the beak, and you can kind of see where it's broken off.
It's a snout.
Yeah. You can see that it's broken off.
Snout.
Yeah. The problem with that argument is that the headdress is missing, right? And that's what I'm looking for, is the headdress on the back of the head, because that's what's in facsimile number 1. And so that's what suggests to me that papyrus was damaged already, because there's no reason for them to have left that off. They don't leave it off in facsimile number 1, right? And so I'm not really sure why it would have been done that way. And we know that these papyrus, fragments, for lack of a better term, because not all of them remain contiguous to each other, obviously. And so the question is, were the others not damaged as well? Because we know facsimile number 1 is damaged, and that's part of the same scroll. And each of the contiguous papyri fragments that follow after it also contain, obviously, the same damage all the way through. And so that would be my question, because, we're not talking about facsimile number 3, very far from facsimile number 1. And that would make far more sense to me, that he would look at a character like this that had been damaged and go, oh, he's black and he's a slave, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, that's where I would want to study that more.
Yeah.
Before I come up with any firm conclusion and saying, yeah, we got this right.
So
Yeah.
it's Anubis, right?
Absolutely.
And Anubis has a snout, right?
Exactly.
So if it was damaged, it wouldn't have been damaged in the front. It would have been damaged in the back, and so your headdress would be missing.
Right.
Yeah, and again, it looks as though that snout was there. I mean, it looks like on that print plate.
That's
that
all I
snout
can
was there.
say. I don't
It's
know
now
for
not.
sure, but it appears that way.
And then
Right.
on the
I feel like I would want to actually examine the plate and see it for myself, because when you're dealing with images, I'm telling you right now that you don't know exactly always what you're looking at, the way the light hits it, everything else. I would just want to see more of it, because whatever happened, assuming it was a snout, right? That's not what ends up in the final version, which would have been done in very close proximity to that thing being created. And so,
yeah, I think that's the argument, by the way, Brent, is that Joseph noticed suddenly that this figure looked like Anubis elsewhere, and he went through the effort to knock that snout off, so that way he wouldn't get caught having a different figure in the document.
right, I don't think he knows who Anubis is.
No, he wouldn't, but he would know that he's giving the same character in 2 different documents different roles.
Unless it's damaged in document in facsimile 1. And I don't know that, I think we're far
and we're
enough in
getting
the
off track,
weeds.
so we can back away from this.
Sorry.
My idea is
that's
Joseph
the
Smith has
problem, is that we could have like literally 3 or 4 podcasts just on this topic.
right.
And with Dan's slides, easily 3 or 4 podcasts on
Well, the
just
purpose
this
of the
topic.
slides is to keep us on track.
Yeah,
I
sorry
gotta
about that.
come in
I
here.
just
Okay,
I needed to
so
ask
here
it.
we go.
I
Okay, we
grabbed
need
my
to look
trip-
at 10, not this one.
Guys, I got to correct myself. I was saying Oli Blish.
Okay,
but of course,
thank you.
Oli Blish is a celestial body. I got it goofed up. The name of the slave is Olimla.
Okay, thank you.
All right, that's important to know.
Okay, so when Joseph Smith, he encounters these papyri, he encounters them as a Bible believer, and he tries to take images in the Bible and use them for interpreting the papyri. So, and we have this one example here, is that if he's looking at facsimile 1, and in the Bible, there's only maybe Joseph and Abraham to choose from, besides Moses. So he picks for this, he looks at that and says that this is Abraham being sacrificed on the altar by a priest of Pharaoh. Well, it reminds him of Abraham trying to sacrifice his own son, Isaac, with a knife in Genesis 22. So I say, my argument is that it's just a simple connection to make here, except the apologists want to connect it with some ancient story about Abraham being sacrificed. The only problem is that the ancient stories aren't so ancient, but they associate it with Abraham being burned in Nimrod's furnace. And another problem to that is that Abraham and Nimrod were not contemporaries. You know, Nimrod came much earlier than Abraham, yet the traditions persist. And Milstein says the priest and his supporters most likely plan first to strike Abraham with a knife and then burn him. So he's trying to blend the two traditions, the facsimile one here with the Islamic tradition. It's also the Jewish traditions. And but the burning, the problem with that is that Abraham gets thrown into the fire and he comes out. So he wasn't put to death with a knife first. So
Right, and there was no knife involved at all.
Right.
No, he's just tossed in the fire.
Right.
And,
So here's what I see Carrie
and he walks
Milstein
around.
doing. Yeah, it's a replication of the 3 Hebrew children that we read about in Daniel, where they get thrown into the fire for refusing to worship the idols of King Nebuchadnezzar. And then they are saved by an angel, or one who is like unto the Son of God, as it's in the King James Version. And they're just walking around having a great time. And finally they come out, and not even their clothes are singed. They've been so completely preserved by the power of God. So this is what happens in these ancient legends, which we'll get to in a second, and which Adam Clarke refers to there in his Holy Bible commentary, which you have a reference to, about this story about Abraham, which basically mirrors the same kind of story, except instead of 3 Hebrew children, it's Abraham who's getting thrown into the furnace, not by Nebuchadnezzar, but by Nimrod, who was also an ancient Babylonian ruler, although Nimrod is in the Bible around the time of the Tower of Babel, and Abraham quite a bit later than that. That's what you're talking about. They're not being contemporaries. So what I see here, though, is that the apologists want to link the attempted sacrifice in the book of Abraham by a knife by a priest of Pharaoh with the ancient legend of the attempted sacrifice of Abraham, even though it doesn't mention anything about a knife. It's completely about a fire preservation in the furnace. And so then you've got Carrie Milstein wanting to have it both ways and just making stuff up here, where
Yes.
you have him quoting from his new book. Let's talk about the book of Abraham, page 87. Let's talk about it. And let's talk about what's in the book of Abraham and what's not in the book of Abraham, and what Carrie Milstein really, really wishes were in the book of Abraham, because then it would match his ancient legend better. He says the priest and his supporters most likely planned to first strike Abraham with a knife, because that's what we have in Abraham 1, and then burn him, which has nothing to do with Abraham 1, but everything to do with this legend.
Yeah.
And that Adam Clarke Bible commentary. Hey, Bill, you there?
Yep, I'm here.
Can you read that upper right thing? Because this is something that was contemporary to Joseph Smith. And even though the apologists want to keep saying Joseph Smith had no way of knowing about this legend, about the attempted sacrifice of Abraham, even though it's by burning in Babylon by Nimrod, yet we find it over and over again in sources that were contemporary with Joseph Smith. It is an ancient legend, but it's been reproduced and was in wide circulation in Joseph Smith's day. Can you read that from Adam Clarke, Bill?
Yeah. I just want to say something first, which is apologists make the argument that when dealing with these translation texts, we have no evidence by the people who acted as scribes that Joseph had any other material with them. But that apologetic response doesn't work, because the inspired Bible translation we know was heavily plagiarized from Adam Clarke's commentary, and the scribes of that also didn't connect the dots and say there was any other document being used. So once you have in one translation work another document being used and none of the scribes talking about it and saying it out loud, it opens up the space that could be happening with all of the translation, any and or all of the translation productions. Now, Adam Clarke commented that the furnace was an ancient mode of punishment among the Chaldeans. If we may credit the tradition that Abram was cast into such a fire by this idolatrous people because he would not worship their gods. Adam Clarke, the Holy Bible, SV Dan 3:6.
And by the way, it does say because he would not worship their idols.
Idols, sorry, yes.
That's okay.
So I need to add something here, and that is that there was an essay that was written by Andrew Hedges, and the title of it was something to the effect, A Wanderer in a Strange Land, Abraham in America, 1800 to 1850. Now I'm going by memory, so don't fault me if I'm wrong. And he says that he went through, different commentaries and all these 19th century sources, and he found literally, almost no data about Abraham from this area, these traditions from this era, nothing. And the fact is that he cites Matthew Henry's commentary. He cites Adam Clarke's commentary. We already have one up here from Daniel, right? From Adam Clarke. And Matthew Henry also cites the tradition in his commentary on Daniel 3 and on Genesis 15. And Adam Clarke does it on Ecclesiastes 14. He does it on 2 Chronicles 2:8. He does it on the Targum or Chaldean paraphrase of the Song of Solomon for chapter 7. He does it in Isaiah 30. And as I said, Daniel 3. So these are the very sources that Andrew Hedges was analyzing, saying that Joseph Smith could not have had access to any of these traditions from the early 19th century because he had already looked at these sources. And yet they're right in the sources that he was analyzing. And that is a corner that apologists have backed themselves into time and time again, saying Joseph Smith could not have known this. It's like the whole thing with Hugh Nibley saying that there's no one that could have known about this tradition of Noah's light in the ark coming from shining stones. No one could have known about that. Well, Adam Clarke talks about it right in his commentary on the Noah narrative. And so that's, a corner I have seen them backed into time and again. I don't know why they do it. It's like the crocodile in Egypt. Oh my gosh. Can you believe that Joseph Smith identified it with the Pharaoh of Egypt? So did all the commentators of the time. So I just honestly don't understand that. Why they constantly back themselves into that no-win corner. And this is a classic example. And we've got more sources to come.
Yes, and the point here is that we don't think Joseph Smith used this for the Book of Abraham.
Of course not.
Right. But we're using these sources to show that their apologetic and their use of ancient sources is not legitimate.
In fact, the way that I would frame it, Dan, is that we're not dealing with literary dependency, but in some cases we may be dealing with cultural dependency. And that's where something that existed in the culture that Joseph Smith may have no clue of where it's coming from, right? His scribes could tell him about it for all we know. Or they may not have. He may have just got it straight from the story of Isaac and his imagination and everything else. But my point is that we need to distinguish really clearly between what we consider literary dependency and what we consider more of a cultural influence. I don't even want to call it a dependency in this case. But in fact, here's an example. We've got both Matthew Henry and Adam Clarke refer to, the attempted execution of Abraham by throwing him in the furnace in their commentaries on Daniel 3, right? Which is about the 3 young children that are going to be thrown into the fire. Well, what do we have in the book of Abraham? 3 virgins are executed for doing the exact same thing that those 3 young children do, and that is they refuse to worship the idols. And so the 3 virgins are executed in the book of Abraham, just like they are attempted to in the book of Daniel. And so I don't think that we can just...
Not by burning.
Right, of course not. Of course.
On the same altar. It says on the same altar.
Exactly. Because it's going to be another Isaac recreation, right? But now, just like, because he's playing off of what's in facsimile number 1. And so we're going to see a recreation of that where we have, Abraham and the attempted execution on him. But then we actually have the execution of the 3 virgins for, again, refusing to worship the idols. And I think that those are things that we need to look at. Are they coincidence? Maybe, but we can't discard them and say that we can't look at these things.
I think that's really interesting, Brent. Can I bring up one thing, just sort of push back on something you said?
Sure.
And it's not so much pushback as I understand that there is no requirement that we show any particular dependency that Joseph Smith may have used from any particular source for this knowledge about the attempted sacrifice of Abraham, though it was, of course, by fire and not by knife in the legend. But I am going to say that you've already listed off a number of different places where Adam Clarke brings up this tradition in his Bible commentary. And it does seem clear that between 1830, which I think is when the translation, the inspired translation of the Bible commenced, through 1833 or so, that Joseph Smith worked his way through the Bible, and probably with Adam Clarke's Bible commentary, that's accounting for so much dependence on it and apparent borrowings from it. And if that is the case, then it would seem to me almost inevitable that during that process, he would have come across at least one, if not more, of these mentions by Adam Clarke in the same commentary he's referencing to this attempted sacrifice of Abraham in Babylon. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that when I look at all of this, I think that it could very well be likely that he could have just as easily got information like this from one of his scribes who were more well-read than he was, right? Like Oliver Cowdery, who we know is quoting Josephus and interpreting some of the papyri. And so, William W. Phelps, of course, who fancied himself to be a great linguistic, which I don't think he was at all, and a reader of books and so on. But so we don't even have to say that he was getting all this directly from reading any source himself. I mean, he could have got it from anyone around him, because it's what I have referred to in the past as prophetic eclecticism, where Joseph Smith was like an environmental sponge. Everybody around him who was feeding him information were unwittingly giving him ideas of what to do and what to say. And then he would recast them in his own form. And so, yeah, I mean, and we'll get to that more in a second. So.
Right. And culturally speaking, it's kind of like the idea that there was a UFO crash in Roswell, Arizona. Pretty much the majority, I'm going to guess, of people, at least in the United States, are aware of that story, whereas probably not all of them have actually read documents themselves about it.
Right, right.
Now, there were some sources that you came up with, Brent, along these lines about this tradition of Abraham and his attempted sacrifice that may be new to the scene. Can you talk about these now? I was going to read these, okay, only because I was asked to, but on this screen, which Dan was nice enough to make with your sources that you provided, are 19th century sources describing in detail the attempted execution of Abraham in Nimrod's furnace. Now, these are 4 face pages or title pages, I should say, of the 4 different documents that you came up with. One of them, one on the furthest left. And by the way, is it possible to blow those up a little bit, Maven?
Nope.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Maybe you can read them better than I can. The first one is the history.
They're bigger on the next slides.
Are they?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Oh, thank you.
Here we go.
How's that?
Right here.
So this one, the first one is the minutes of an address delivered before the anti-Masonic convention of Reading, Massachusetts. This is from January of 18. I think that's 29. Am I reading that correctly?
Yes.
By Reverend P. Sanborn. So the interesting thing here is that this legend is so ubiquitous in this time and place of Joseph Smith that it even shows up in an anti-Masonic tract from 1829.
Yes.
And there we have Section 5, dialogue between Abraham and Nimrod, right? These are the main players. Nimrod commanded Abraham to worship the fire, but Abraham said no. And it goes back and forth. Why should I worship the fire when water can put out the fire? Well, then worship the water. Why should I worship the water when, the clouds sustain the water? Well, worship the clouds. Why should I? This is this back and forth dialogue between Nimrod and Abraham. It's quite clever. And it's finally leading to the fact that no matter what it is you talk about, you worship, there's always something above it until you get to the one God who is the creator of all things. And that is who Abraham says should be worshiped. And this doesn't go over very well with Nimrod because he thinks that Abraham is making fun of him or deriding him. And he says, look, I only worship the fire. And if you don't do the same thing, my intention is to throw you into the fire. I'm doing a little bit of RFM interpretation on this,
nice.
The RFM translation. And then I shall see whether the God you worship will come to your relief. And immediately had him thrown into the fiery furnace. In the interim, they questioned his brother Haran, that's Abraham's brother, concerning his faith, who answered, if Abraham succeeds, I will be of his faith, but if not, I'll be of Nimrod's faith. Wise guy, Haran. He is definitely hedging his bets. He's even Andrew hedging his bets. So upon which Nimrod ordered him to be thrown into the fire likewise. Oh, that wasn't good enough for Nimrod, where he was presently consumed. You see, because Haran was of mixed faith. He's consumed by the fire when he gets thrown in. But Abraham came out of the furnace smelling like a freaking rose, right? Without receiving the least injury. So here's a source, 1829, in an anti-Masonic tract that is published in 1829, I think I said, in Massachusetts.
Correct.
Next. This is from the History of Redemption. And these things have very long titles, and some of the words are too small for me to read, but that's mainly, this is by Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards being a very, very famous preacher in Joseph Smith's day.
And
Go
I
ahead.
should add that the material here,
that one.
because this is an edited volume of Jonathan Edwards' book from 1793. And so what you see here are footnotes that have been added by the editors.
Right. So the editors are, this is a collection of sermons or writings by Jonathan Edwards, and the editors who put them together put footnotes on them, and they include the same story about Nimrod and Abraham.
Same.
And it looks like very much the same story that was told in the one before.
It's exactly,
Precisely.
it's exactly
the same tradition.
Yes.
Yeah.
And next, this is Lala Ruch, an Oriental Romance by Thomas More. Now that's a famous name, Thomas More. I don't know if it's the same one.
Right, it is.
Is it? But it's from 1820, published in London. And this is where, in a footnote, this is a footnote to a book. This is like an epic poem.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
This is a piece of poetry that he writes, and this is the footnote that he includes.
Right, and here it says the footnote is the Gabers. Now, what the heck is a Gaber? Ghebers. Oh, wait, I'll bet that's the Hebrews.
Yes.
The Hebrews, the Gabers. Okay, he was a Hebrew Jew. The Gabers say that when Abraham, their great prophet, so it is supposed to be a word that means Hebrews, was thrown into the fire by order of Nimrod, the flame turned instantly into a bed of roses, where the child sweetly reposed.
Yeah.
So there it is, even in a footnote to an epic poem.
Right.
This is how widely
RFM?
distributed. Yes?
Just a quick note. Gaber, a member of an Iranian religious sect practicing a modern version of Zoroastrianism.
Well, that's funny because it talks about Gaber being Abraham being their great prophet. But regardless, thank you for looking that up.
That's what the Quran has.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. So this would be like from an Islamic tradition because it gets carried over. You got Christianity.
They originated it actually, and it was imported into Judaism later.
You think so? Okay, great. All right. Because I know that there are legends about Abraham from the Christian. Well, let's start with the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, and certainly from the Islamic tradition, because they are all three people of the book, by which is generally meant the Old Testament, right?
And just to note, Wikipedia says Zoroastrianism is heavily influenced by the Abrahamic religions.
Boom. Great. Thank you, Bill. You're a marvel. There it is again. And now the fourth reference that Brent found through his own personal research. And this is from a book called The History of Persecutions. And it is really, really tough for me to see. That's 1813? 15?
Yeah. 13.
It's 1813. Yeah. So in the history of persecution, we once again get a reference to this Abrahamic tradition. Abraham suffered many persecutions upon the account of his opposition to the idolatry of his country, and that he was particularly imprisoned for it by Nimrod in Ur. By the way, it's really interesting to me that Joseph Smith, when he has facsimile 1, which he interprets as being an attempted sacrifice of Abraham by an Egyptian priest, and it's obviously on an Egyptian papyri, that he feels compelled, I'm going to say, to put it and locate it not in Egypt, but in Ur, in Babylon.
Right.
And I think that may or may not be significant. Some of the Eastern, going on with this quote from The History of Persecution, some of the Eastern writers also tell us that he was thrown into the fire, but that he was miraculously preserved from being consumed in it by God. Excuse me. This tradition also the Jews believed, and is particularly mentioned by Jonathan in his Targum upon Genesis 11:28. Nimrod threw Abraham into a furnace of fire because he would not worship his idol, but the fire had no power to burn him. Period. End of quote from The History of Persecution.
So just to add a quick comment here is that there are numerous sources like this. We don't even begin to have time to go through all of the sources that cover this. We literally just picked out a few to throw them in here because there are so many. I've got a folder that all it is 19th century sources on relationships to the Book of Abraham, ranging from the crocodile, the four sons of Horus, the attempted execution of Abraham. And there's over 1,000 files in that folder. And so we don't even have time to begin to go through all of those. But the idea that folks like Dan and I have not spent time with the Book of Abraham narrative is a false narrative, because that's precisely what we've done. And that's been our interest. Is, in fact, I would suspect, I don't know about you, Dan, but certainly for me, that's probably what I was looking at first, right? When I got into this, was looking at the narrative and looking at 19th century cultural sources, for lack of a better term, or influences that could have, had some impact on the text. And I mean, that goes back to the early 1980s. So yeah, I don't even want to suggest that that Dan and I have done anything other than look extremely closely at both the narrative and the manuscripts. That has been our focus. That's certainly been my focus since the 80s. And so I don't know where people get this idea from that so-called critics of the church, which I, again, as the title of this podcast says, I view this as critical scholarship. This is what biblical critics do. It's what other scholars do when they're analyzing texts like this. And so I want to make it really clear that this is something that Dan and I and others have been looking at for decades. This is nothing new to us. And for apologists to suggest that we have ignored the text and only focused on the manuscripts, frankly, is utter nonsense.
Dan.
Yes.
We're going to do this on this wonderful presentation. We're at 7:15 now, my time, 8:15 Bill's time, 9:15 Dan's time, and 10:15 Brent's time. We basically got the entire nation covered.
We'll have to come back.
You're definitely going to come back. We're going to arrange it. But what I want to do is put out the call for phone calls. And while we're doing that, give Dan the chance to respond to what John Ghee said in the same way that Brent did, or at least on that same issue. Can we put out the call number first?
Yeah. Yep. So to call the show, it is. I'm going to wait for it here to show back up one more time.
There's something about a 666 in there. I know that.
Yeah. It's 662 667 6667 or 662 Mormons with an S on the end. And please call in now. We'll get a couple of callers in. And Dan, by all means.
And Dan, now, what would you say? We've got John Ghee. He's present. He's not talking.
Oh, it's right there, huh?
What would you say to him about his comment from just last December that the problem with you, Dan, is you don't look at the text of the Book of Abraham?
Oh, so he said that. in that interview, while my book had been out for nearly a year almost, he's saying that, making those statements that we don't pay attention to the English text. And then he proceeds to go on and talk about the characters coming from various parts of the Hor Papyrus, and all of that is answered in that book. And he can say that. And the reason why he says stuff like that is because he has also said on other occasions he doesn't pay attention to what the critics say. So maybe he should change his view. If you're really interested in the truth, you go everywhere. I read his stuff. I read whoever's stuff to learn whatever I can, wherever I can, and looking for the truth. That's what scholars do. They read everybody. They don't have any boundaries about, they're not politically motivated, and they're looking for the truth no matter where it is.
Very
or else
good.
you're going to get caught with your pants down.
Maybe he's concerned that if he starts reading your books, John Ghee will go the way of Brian Hauglid.
Well, I think they're both giving out hints that they're going to switch over to the catalyst theory.
Yeah. And they both being Muhlestein and Ghee, correct?
We'll be there waiting for him.
Oh, we're going to talk about that next time, believe me. That's huge.
He really walked that line. Like I kind of lean towards the missing scroll, but the the catalyst theory, I get it. I can see it. It was such a difference, wasn't it? You nailed it, Dan. I think he is setting himself up to be able to switch teams, kind of like Hauglid did after the Ugo Prego announcement, right?
That's where everybody's going. See, if you're hanging on to a literal position, there, if
Perigo, is it Perigo? I think I pronounced it wrong. Ugo Perigo, maybe. I always have trouble with it. Yeah, no biggie. Anyway, finish, Dan. Sorry about that.
Isn't that the DNA guy?
Yeah, and then he said that the Lions kid wasn't Joseph Smith. Meanwhile, Haglid's ideology required that to be the case. And so as soon as the announcement was made, he announced how he had switched teams and he was on the other side now. And
I see. In that issue.
Yeah, similar. Okay. Anyway, just
so Muhlestein and Ghee have a fundamentalist interpretation or a paradigm they're working in to understand and interpret the Book of Abraham. So they look at the Hor Papyrus. So if the Hor Papyrus isn't translatable into the Book of Abraham, well, there had to be some document that Joseph Smith translated that was the Book of Abraham written in Egyptian. And since it talks about the facsimiles in chapter 1 of the Book of Abraham, it had to be at the end. There had to be two books attached to each other. And that's the logic that they follow. And that's just a literal fundamentalist thing. And they're stuck in that mode for now. Mm-hmm. Whereas a lot of the younger apologists have moved on to accept the evidence. The obvious evidence has been obvious from the day one or a few days after, Gerald Tanner and Heward, I forget his name. They wrote an article in Dialogue showing that the characters in the margins are copied sequentially from the Hor Papyrus, and that was out. That was it. It was over. Game over. Well, then we had a few people that are very stubborn and want it to be literal, and so they make up stuff that doesn't really pan out very well. And no one's really challenged them for many years, and that's why I took it on. Well, but Brent and I, we knew all the stuff that's in my book decades ago. I mean, it comes from Edward Ashmont, partially, and I decided to put it into the book, expand it a little bit, give it a more historical sense to each of these points of view, and to show that the reverse translation theory is just an apologetic and Nibley apologetic that was made up before Nibley knew anything about the papyrus or the grammar. He said he hadn't spent like 15 minutes on the grammar, when he made up the reverse translation theory and tried to get Joseph Smith out of the bind, So anyway,
I would say,
he would read my book, and if he disagrees, respond to it. Enter the dialogue that scholars are already engaged in.
He doesn't even respond to Robert Ridner.
Yeah,
I just have to say that one of the worst pieces on the Book of Abraham manuscripts that I think has ever been written, it's so awful, is the meaning of the Kirtland Egyptian papers by Hugh Nibley. And that is cited by everyone.
Yeah.
And it is so inaccurate time and time again. And it's like, Hugh, how did you get this stuff so wrong? And it's clear that he was probably not given access to the originals and was working off of microfilms. And so I kind of give him a bit of a pass on that, right? But at the same time, I want to alert people to say that is one of the most inaccurate articles I have ever read on the manuscripts of the Book of Abraham and the Egyptian Project, for that matter. And yet some of the very arguments that he makes in that article continue on to this day. And it's like, wow.
Warmed over.
Yeah, exactly. And
they
it's
follow the same apologetic, keep it alive. They're keeping it alive. But I'm hoping that those are signs that we've been perceiving of them going towards a catalyst theory. It's a somewhat better theory, even though it does have problems.
Right.
I just got done listening.
It at least gives people an option of their own spiritual quest that lies outside of, talking about, I don't know, the physicality and everything else of all of these documents and manuscripts, and going into details and arguing about, what's ancient, what isn't. But there are still some with the catalyst theory who still believe that what's being revealed is ancient.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And that's every bit as problematic as the initial theories.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, I don't know. How are you going to take it? Do you want your catalyst theory to be basically that this was a product of Joseph Smith's experience with God? Or do you want it to actually be that this was God revealing to Joseph Smith an ancient record?
Right.
And if it's the latter, you're going to have problems.
And mainly because it refers to facsimile 1.
Right. And that's what I'm saying, right? Is that it's like
you cannot totally separate it from the papyri. So some want to propose an unconscious fraud, and then I want to propose a conscious deception on Joseph Smith's part. He may have felt inspired in a very general, loose kind of way, like a patriarch giving you a patriarchal blessing feels inspired. But he felt authorized to use deception in order to get people to believe what he thought was his inspired writing.
And this is where you all know I love Dan as much as I can love Dan, right? He's like a brother to me. But this is something where we kind of part ways. especially on this project. And the reason why is that I was actually asked at a dinner I was asked to speak at the Alta Club. And, you know, I mentioned during the course of this that I think that there are clear occasions where Joseph Smith was obviously sincere in what he was doing. And the person who had kind of organized the whole thing, it was just a small, intimate gathering. And I actually had some of my family members there. And he asked me, can you give us the number one example of Joseph Smith being sincere in anything with his revelations? And I said, well, to be honest with you, I haven't thought about what the number one is, but I can give you a couple of examples. And the ones that I gave were, one is a curse that he puts upon Philashtus Hurlbut that's in his journal, and it's in his handwriting. And I said, this is an example of where he believes that God is behind him on this, right? He actually invokes God's name in the curse, right? And he has an audience of one himself. That's it. There's nobody else that he's trying to impress. And then I get to the Egyptian project, where Joseph Smith has an audience of two, Oliver Cowdery and William W. Phelps. And he has no plans to publish this stuff. He's just going through it. And I look at that and go, man, I'm having a hard time with just saying that he was consciously acting as a fraud, doing this to impress these two people, when he already had so many people being disrupted by other revelations that he had given. Why would he care about impressing two ardent, and I mean ardent, believers in what he was doing? In fact, during the time that they're working on this project, right? When Oliver Cowdery comes to the patriarchal blessing book, and he's working on it with Joseph Smith, they're actually making changes to earlier blessings that Joseph Smith had given to other people. And then Oliver Cowdery actually has a vision of the future life of Joseph Smith. And he goes through it in detail, and he is saying things that never came to pass, right? He says that Joseph Smith would live to a good old age until his hair was like the wool. Well, that never happened. And then at the end of it, he says, and I wrote, unless the reader doubt what I'm saying, I wrote this while I was in my vision. So these guys are ardent believers. Joseph Smith did not have to convince them of anything. And yet here he is doing this project that's going into all this detail of this Egyptian stuff. And I look at that and think, no, we're seeing Joseph Smith at work. We're seeing Joseph Smith, the believer, doing his thing. And it may be completely nonsensical to us in a modern era, just like people speaking in tongues or doing other stuff that we think is kind of on the fringe. But I can't look at all that and say that Joseph Smith was consciously trying to deceive anyone during that time. And even when he publishes the Book of Abraham, the church never sees the manuscripts that they come from, right? And that's where he's inventing characters and doing all kinds of things to make this thing make sense to him and his scribes. And then he goes ahead and publishes this thing as canon in the Times and Seasons. Well, semi-canon. And I look at that and say, I think what you're looking at is who Joseph Smith really was. And that was that he was a religionist of his era. They had extreme ideas and views. And they were being released in all these different revelatory ways that some of us would never agree with. And so for me to say that he is consciously trying to deceive people, I have a problem with that any more than I do when I look at the folks back in his day who claim to have very similar visions to Joseph Smith's first vision. I don't think that they were all trying to consciously deceive anyone. I think that they were people of their time who understood their experience, strange as it may be to all of us, right? And I'm certainly not imputing the divine to it, but it's a completely foreign world to us. You know, this is a world where they believe in that magic exists, that treasures can actually sink into the ground and then hurl themselves along the ground. This is a world that none of us can relate to. And so that's why I kind of take a pause on that and step back. And believe me, I appreciate what my brother Dan is saying, because Dan and I have talked about this many times. And
not really.
And I understand where he's coming from. But you know, I just had to throw that
Brent,
out there.
your position is
others who don't always agree.
Okay, listen, your position is that Joseph Smith, all that stuff he dictated, the Book of Abraham and the alphabet and grammar, he believed he was really translating?
I think that he had a completely different sense of what translation was. So, for example,
you sound like an apologist.
Yeah, so does the LDS Church in 2022.
So listen for a second. When he's inventing those characters, right?
Yes.
Well, guess what? Some of those invented characters that are in those documents come from earlier things that he had already been working on the Adamic language. And I think that and these were things that no one would have ever seen. I mean, the only reason why we know he was doing this before the Egyptian alphabet manuscripts is because William W. Phelps records them in a letter to his wife Sally in May.
So, Brent,
right?
do you think that the angels really came and ordained them?
Oh, hell no, Dan.
Well,
that's not what I'm saying at all. Okay, in that case,
using the papyri with a fake history that they had just invented. Of course, he's not playing to Cowdery. Cowdery's playing with him against W. Phelps. W. Phelps is a supposed expert in the church on languages, and he's working with Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith wants his testimony.
But he already has it, right? Phelps is
not about the Book of Abraham.
No, but Phelps is already working on the D&C and revising it. And then when you go back to the May 1826/1827 letter to his wife Sally, he has a specimen of the pure language of Adam. And it's like Phelps is the only one who knows about this, right?
So far,
we haven't found it in any other document.
Well, we have the English part of it in an earlier version, 1832, is in the Revelation book.
Exactly. In fact, well, it's in more than just the Revelation book.
Yes, it's in other places, which contradicts your theory that it was just a thing that he showed Phelps.
Yeah, it's in two other documents. The one by Frederick G. Williams, and then one by Pratt as well, right? Because Pratt refers to it in conference back in Utah when he gets there. But what I'm saying is that you have this situation of where, you know, Phelps is writing this stuff down, and the way he writes it down, because this is the first time in this specimen that he sends to Sally that we see the characters associated with the interpretations of the Adamic language. And it's written out in the same way that we're going to find these so-called Egyptian characters in the Egyptian alphabet. It's categorized in the same columns going down. And that's before he ever gets the papyrus. So that's all. That's
the paucity of evidence.
I think people are loving
fraud.
Okay, I'm just.
Were there real plates? Were there real plates?
No.
People with fake.
I was going to say maybe you're in Bushman's camp.
No.
Why all of a sudden when he gets the Book of Abraham, he's sincere.
Right. So here you go. I don't believe that there were any plates at all.
So there, Dan.
Not fabricated plates, nothing.
And I think Joseph Smith was sincere, but used deception.
Right. So here you go. Where I'm getting this from is the early revelations talk about, well, they actually give the exact ways that someone can see the plates. And one is that Joseph Smith has no power to show the plates to anyone, right? And secondly, they have to have faith in God. They have to be given a commission by God to see them. And then they have to have faith enough to see the plates. That suggests to me that there are no plates at all. And I mean, when I read the stories about what's happening with the plates, when the plates get passed out the window of the house to his sister, and she just takes them in the box and goes off with them. And I'm like, how are you carrying anything like that? You know, you're this young girl and you're going off with these plates. And then, of course, when they go to the Cooper's shop and they rip up the floorboards, this is the money diggers who are now coming after the plates. And all they find is the smashed box that supposedly he kept them in underneath the floorboards. And Joseph goes, oh, well, it's a good thing a good thing that I put them in a barrel of beans.
And it worked for some of them.
Right. And I'm just like, wait a second. Those money diggers found the plates, and it was an empty box. Those were the plates. And that's what they found.
The money diggers didn't find it. Joseph Smith broke the box.
Right. Well, either way, doesn't matter to me. Right.
If there were plates,
point,
they were in there.
The point is that
Joseph Smith broke the box in order to create. The money diggers couldn't find it because the stone never worked. And the story is not in the barrel of beans. The plates were up in the loft in the hay. I mean, they didn't search the cooper's shop. They just went for the floor. The stone didn't work. They didn't find the plates. Joseph Smith broke the plates. That's the most logical answer.
I think the plates were in the conservatory with the candlestick.
That's all good. But still,
Anyway, we should get on to calls.
Right. But just a last point.
Man.
Get to places where people had opportunities to view the plates, they never do. I mean, I'm talking about Emma Smith supposedly rustling the edge of the plates, never looks under the cloth. They go to Isaac Hale's home. Isaac Hale never goes into the room to take a peek at the plates. And it's kind of like every opportunity that someone has to see the the physical.
Doesn't want to show his tin plates.
It's completely ignored.
What? The plates are tin. That's why no one sees them.
Well, I'm just saying, why doesn't anyone peek under the cloth?
Well, they're scared.
I would. I mean, that would be the first thing I would do. I'd walk into the room and go, wait, so you're telling me
they don't want to be
things.
If you look, you're done.
You're smitten, Brent. Plates underneath this cloth, and I can't peek under it and take a look. And it's like, oh, Joseph's out of the room, looking left and right, pick it up, but nobody ever does that.
You and I would, but we don't believe anything's going to happen.
Right.
I think Vogel's right. I think they're scared shitless.
Well, no, it's like the final scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Right. But the thing is that I don't know if they have that perception, but I think that there is this criteria.
Okay, if they're not looking under the cloth, that implies something's there. What's there, Brent?
A box.
Just
the supposed box that he has it in.
Emma said it rustled with the sound of metal.
And
so did Demon.
Dan, money diggers heard the treasure rumbling through the earth.
Right. Once some of it's that made up, it can be just that made up.
Exactly.
Can I just make an observation to try and tie a bow on this and get some calls in?
So I just want to tell you this.
Go ahead.
I do still love you, Brent.
I still love you too. And I just want you guys to know that we can talk about this stuff this way. Right? And we still come away as best friends.
Yes. So, if you love and respect each other,
Oh, hell yeah.
I expect one of you to start saying I'm on top of the world. Or is it I'm king of the world? Whatever that line is from Titanic.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So I just want people to see that scholars can have different perspectives.
Yeah.
And they don't always have to agree. But that doesn't mean that we don't respect the other scholars' opinions. Because what Dan says, I respect. I look at his ideas and I say, you know something? He's got a point. I can't say he doesn't have a point, right? Because I think he has a point. And I'm just saying, and I have another point, but it may or may not be the most accurate, because now we're talking about how do we interpret the most nebulous elements of early Mormon history, right?
Yeah.
And that's spiritual artifacts, for goodness sake. And I think it's okay for each of us to have our own opinions and still walk away as wonderful friends. And Dan and I have done this time and time again. And Dan, you know I love you, and I'm talking too long. Go on.
You're right, Brent.
My only observation that I was going to make
This is
before I
how
get
we
these phone
find the
calls in
truth.
here
Exactly.
is
It was a
that
tie.
I think it's wonderful that the one of the two of you who believes that Joseph Smith was sincere in some ways
Yes.
is the one who's arguing that there were no plates at all.
Exactly.
The irony.
The irony of it all. Yes.
Oh, I love it. We'll call it a tie. You guys both made some good points.
Yes.
It's a tie. We're
And
just
they're
we
hugely
have-
entertaining. I think the audience is loving
Can
it.
we still get
Yeah.
some calls in, though?
let's do it.
Okay.
All right. So here's the first one. This
We're
is
gonna talk about this, probably.
what's that? And let me just add to just quickly what an eclectic aggregator he was. Like, there is a miracle in taking all of this stuff and putting it together in a coherent story. To me, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
All right. Mormon Jesus wants to talk about Joseph Smith's photographic memory. Mormon Jesus, you're on with Mormonism Live. Go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, Dan Vogel and Brent Metcalfe. I'd like you guys to gain a testimony of Joseph Smith's photographic memory. When I created Joseph Smith, I gave him a photographic memory. And the reason he is able to do all the dictations that Dan speaks of, or the catalyst theory that Brent speaks of, is because any book he read, such as the Dartmouth College books that Hiram had obtained, or Adam Clark's commentary, he could simply scroll through his mind and dictate any part he wanted. And I really think it would come in handy when you communicate with your apologetic friends that you testify that you know Joseph Smith has a photographic memory. Just like when they say they know Joseph Smith is a prophet.
Yeah, no, thank you, caller.
Dan?
There's no evidence that Joseph Smith quoted anything besides the Bible.
Exactly.
Yeah, and on that much they agree. Anyway, I think that's of note. All right, Trevor is caller number 2. Trevor, you're on Mormonism Live. Any thoughts?
Yes, I've actually been sitting on this question for a month, waiting for this episode. So
Love it.
I'm not going to be able to steelman this argument because it's way too involved. But there's a man that I've been talking to called named Paul Gregerson, and he claims that all the scholars and all the church apologetics or apologists have it wrong, and that Joseph Smith was never translating anything to correspond with ancient Egyptian. And instead, it correlates with the book of Genesis. And I was just wondering if Dan or Brent, and I know that backyard professors in the chat, I was wondering if you guys have heard of him and what your thoughts on his take on it is.
Awesome.
Yes,
Thank
I
you.
have. Have you heard of him, Brent?
No, this is yours.
Oh, you're not missing much.
Okay.
Well, Grierson, yeah, he has a few videos out that I watched part of before I couldn't take anymore. but he has this theory, but he has no evidence for it. But his presentation of it is that how Joseph Smith he uses numbers to get a different translation and to try to show how Joseph Smith used, and the numbers he uses are the numbers in the times and seasons on the facsimiles. So he talks about he only talks about the facsimiles as far as I know, but I'll stick with the majority of the experts on Egyptology and Grierson can make up anything he wants to make up and see connections wherever he wants to see connections, but can he present it in a scholarly fashion that will convince other scholars at the same time of saying that all the scholars in the world are wrong except him? Well, I think that tells us where he's coming from right there.
Okay. Yeah, I'd seen some of that stuff too, and again, I don't know near as much as any of the three of you, but as I started to look at it, it just right away didn't seem reasonable to me. It didn't seem to make rational sense. All right, we've got two more quick, please.
Can I just interject by saying that it is amazing to me the fecundity of the human imagination to come up with explanations to account for Joseph Smith's translation, all for one reason and one reason only, because his translation does not match the Egyptian that was on the papyri.
Yeah, and an unwillingness to maybe face the most rational conclusion.
Yeah.
Because that answer isn't the answer we want.
They're about saving Joseph Smith from himself.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Somebody here wants to talk about they can't really tolerate Mormon scholars. So I'm curious if they mean like all Mormon scholars or like believing Mormon scholars. So you are on the air, my friend. Hello. Okay. I'm going to drop that one.
They probably went to sleep waiting so long.
They probably did. They were on hold for a little while. So our last caller is Kobe. And Kobe, you're on Mormonism Live. What do you have for us tonight?
Hey, Bill. Hey, RFM. And Dan and Brent, thanks for being here. When you were talking about, first, I just want to thank Dan for his Book of Abraham book. I just finished it today, and it's fantastic. My question for Dan and Brent is whether in the facsimile 3, the slave that you were talking about, did the Egyptians even have dark-skinned slaves at that time? Because my understanding is they mostly had Caucasian slaves from Europe. And is that just another example of Joseph's racism coming through, seeing a dark figure and calling that a slave? Thanks.
Okay, and hang on just a second, Kobe, because Dan has that look on his face like he doesn't know what we're asking. So I want to make sure you understand the question.
It sounded kind of broken up, so I couldn't get every word.
Yeah, and I don't know enough about this stuff to repeat it to you. And my,
Well, I heard it was Joseph Smith racist, and I would say yes.
Are you talking about Anubis in the facsimile 3, Kobe?
Olimla.
I'm wondering if the placement of a black slave is anachronistic. That's really the question I'm asking, Dan.
Okay, say that again. I'm sorry, Kobe. I'm not trying.
Is the question of a black slave anachronistic?
Is a black slave anachronistic?
Oh, you mean did the Egyptians have black slaves?
Yeah.
I guess they got him wherever they could get him. That's just me.
Well,
if they didn't, we've got a problem.
The black slave is an American thing,
right?
And the slaves have been around since the beginning of time, and then weren't necessarily associated with race.
Exactly.
And in America, blacks became the objects of slavery, and so they had to justify it. They would refer to the Bible. Genesis, about Canaan being the slave of in the tents of Shem, and Joseph Smith actually, in the inspired revision, enhanced that and said that a darkness came upon Canaan. And so he, even though he tried to take an abolitionist position when he was trying to get the land back in Jackson County, early on, when he's working on the Bible revision in Genesis, he actually is helping support slavery by enhancing that passage in Genesis. So yes, Joseph Smith was a racist.
Yeah,
and he's trying it in the scriptures, and I'm glad to be rid of it.
Right, and I would say that he was as racist as the people who wrote the Constitution of the United States, which basically treats black folk, right, as less than, almost less than human. They're less than white people, right? And when you look at that picture, it's obvious where his mind went, and it went in a similar direction to what we would find in the Constitution of the United States, as awful as that may seem. A lot of people may not even realize that. They should go back and read it, you know, where it explains the worth of you know, a black man in the United States.
Well, yeah, you got a black person in this facsimile, and what's it going to be except for a slave, right?
Exactly.
From Joseph Smith's point of view. By the way, did a little impromptu research. Happy to report that, yes, my guess is right. Of course, they're going to get him from wherever they can. They can go out to the white people, or they can go, the Egyptians can go west or south up the Nile to get slaves from black people. So here's what slavery in Egypt from Wikipedia says, right? The people enslaved in Egypt during Islamic times, of course, that's Islamic times, isn't it? That's probably later. Anyway, mostly came from Europe and Caucasus, referred to as white, or from the Sudan and Africa south of the Sahara, through the trans-Saharan slave trade, referred to as black. That says that's Islamic times. I don't know why it would be any different in earlier times, but I could be corrected on that.
Yeah, and whether it was or not, I mean, don't forget, there were also traditions during that time that Egyptians themselves were black, right? I mean, that's kind of where you get the concept of this is black as Egypt.
Yeah.
And
yeah, I could see.
And so there were concepts of that back in that time, but I think that Joseph Smith is imposing an American construct onto this facsimile.
I do too, and I think we see that in the Book of Mormon too, where in this Nephite record, all of a sudden it starts talking about how all are equal before God, black and white, slave or bond and free, which seems a little bit jarring in the context. It looks like the 19th century in which Joseph Smith is inhabiting suddenly gets pushed into the text of an ancient thing that he's translating. By the way, something else says that in ancient Egypt, black slaves were used for domestic service and were also used as soldiers.
Right.
And just so people are clear, I'm not laughing at you talking about slaves. There's just a comment about Brent's arms are still so massive, he's almost splitting those sleeves open. I over here chuckling while you're talking about slavery, and I wanted to make sure the audience knew where my laugh was coming from.
Don't get Brent mad. I'll turn into a raging green Hulk monster.
I apologize for that.
No, dude.
If you get me
worked out more than me. You deserve it.
So if you get me angry, my shirt will completely rip open. So
yeah. I hear you, brother. Glad you're there and I'm here.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's our calls for the night. Anything else from you, RFM, before we close out the show?
I'm sorry. Was that you, Brent?
No, that was Bill.
It's not my house.
God, the
It was
barking.
Anubis.
No, that's embarrassing.
Not without a snout, it's not.
So we have 4 dogs here, and they're making their presence well known right now. So I apologize for that.
No, that's okay. It's great. I love it. I love dogs. So we're going to continue this at a future date, and with what we have prepared, we can probably fill 3 more podcasts of a similar length. So don't do any more preparation is what I'm saying, Dan. And Brent.
We just use what we got for the next year.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you what, you guys just tell me what topics you disagree on, and we'll just put you on and give you guys 2 hours to chat it up.
You see, if the audience knew everything that we've been going through in preparation for this and trying to get this thing to work, I think it's worked splendidly. And I'm really glad that Dan and Brent have done everything they've done, and that they are cool enough with the whole thing to not only express their opinions to each other and to the audience, but also to just like cut it here and say, okay, we'll save the rest for another day.
Amen. And with that.
And
did you?
Oh yeah, especially that last half hour.
So I just have to end this by telling Dan again that he's my brother. I love him. He knows that. And Dan, I can't wait to see you again. It's been way too long. I mean, this pandemic crap has just been awful, and I want to see my friends again.
That's a beautiful way to end
very
this agreement.
Careful.
Yeah.
My wife.
I know. I understand.
Now, Maven has shown up, and Maven, are you eating something?
Well, I think is this
breakfast.
Life?
Everybody's eating.
Oh my God.
Sorry.
Did
eating breakfast?
$1,000
Get hungry for some scrambled eggs myself. Go ahead.
So wait a second. Did we go on for that long?
Just about.
Breakfast?
It's 1 o'clock somewhere.
Oh my gosh.
No. Just we're good. I'm just making a joke.
Sorry, everybody.
Maven, please.
Did you have anything you want to say, Maven?
We got a $2,000 donation. I think.
Holy Toledo.
Brent,
Nice.
Aaron, I don't know.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So much.
We're good luck, aren't we?
Yeah. Look at that. Awesome.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry. I was shouting at the time. Who's that from? Did you say, Maven?
It says Aaron Metcalfe.
Ooh.
So is that?
Who the hell is that?
I got no idea. But we've got to have you on the show
Aaron.
more often, Brent.
I may be related to her.
I'm not letting my wife watch this.
So, oh my gosh.
All right. You guys said a lot of things. We're going to let somebody else get the last word in. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
And so I start out with an assumption that the Book of Abraham and the Book of Mormon and anything else, excuse me, that we get from the restored gospel is true. Therefore, any evidence I find, I will try and fit into that paradigm. I don't feel that I need to defend that paradigm. I feel that I want to understand the evidence that I find within that paradigm, because to me it's a given that it's true. There are others who will assume that it's not true, and on these points we'll just have to agree to disagree, but we will understand one another better when we understand how our beginning assumptions color the way we filter all of the evidence that we find.
Those damn assumptions.
So,
Kolob, Limdy, Zip,
All right.
Viral,
oh my God.
Venus, no, Venesti, Wayne, Oxen Wagon, no, Wago Ox Owen. Wago Ox Owen. There's Onsley, Shibble, Shine Fliss, and Os. These are the Egyptian names as revealed through the stone. There's also planets, planet names that I learned. Of the 15 moving planets, there are Owen Isis, there's Flos Isis, Flo S, Ab Essel, El Ash, Sable, Slundlow, Earrome, Crash My Craw, Obelisk Ism, Ism Ball, and Missile. Well,
Okay.